Once upon a time, long, long ago, there was a king who had 3 daughters. And of course, he lived in a castle. This king loved trees. He admired their strength and beauty. He had one tree right outside the castle, an apple tree that was his very favorite tree. And he announced, anyone who takes an apple from this tree will go 100 fathoms below the earth. His daughters heard that. The daughters watched the tree flower and smelled the fragrance of the blossoms. His daughters watched the tree leaf out into green and the apples grow until they were blood red, and they were so thick and so shiny that the tree looked exhausted holding them up. But they remembered that if they were to have a bite, well, one day, the youngest, she looked at her sisters and said, "Father can't mean us." No, Father doesn't mean we can't have an apple. We're princesses, aren't we? He means strangers. He means common people. He wouldn't send us 100 fathoms below the earth. And so she picked an apple. She had a bite. It was juicy and delicious. She took it to her sisters. Each of them had a bite. And instantaneously, they were swallowed by the earth and disappeared. All before noon. The father waited for them to come to lunch, and they didn't. Not that day, not the next day, not the next day, not the next day. No sign of his 3 beloved daughters. He had the apple tree, but he had no daughters. And so he proclaimed, as kings do, anyone who finds my daughters and brings them safely home can marry one of them. And so the news went out everywhere. And it came to 3 brothers, all huntsmen. And they decided that they would go and find the princesses. So out they went. Now a huntsman is not likely to marry a princess. You get that, right? So when a huntsman decides to try, it's a great, great decision. Off they went, the 3 of them, and they came to a castle, not the castle of the king. The castle, when they entered, smelled so much like wonderfully cooked food that they followed their noses until they were in a dining room with gorgeous plates and glasses and wine and steaming food. The bread was still warm. They stood there waiting for someone to come. No one did. They waited and waited, hours. No one came. The food never got cool. It steamed that whole time till their hunger got the best of them and they sat down to eat. The food was delicious, and so the 3 brothers decide, I know what we'll do. One of us will stay here, and the 2 will go out and look for the princesses and come back. And we'll just take turns, because this castle is a very good place to be. And so it was agreed, on the first day, the 2 younger brothers went out, leaving the older brother behind. When this little gnome came in to the room and said, could I please have a piece of bread? Of course. So the older brother gave him a piece of bread, but the gnome dropped it on the floor. I dropped it on the floor. Would you please pick it up for me? And when the older brother leaned over to pick it up, the gnome got a stick and beat him about the head, and beat him on the back, and wailed on him, and then disappeared. Well, you boys can answer this question better than girls, but when the 2 younger brothers came, even though the older brother could hardly stand up straight because he was so badly hurt, he didn't tell them what had happened. Did everything go well? Yes, just fine. The next day, the oldest and the youngest went, leaving brother number 2 behind. Could I please have a piece of bread? Said this wizened, elfish creature. Of course, and he was given the bread. The gnome dropped it. Oh, I dropped it. Will you pick it up? And when the second brother leaned over to pick it up, the gnome took a stick and beat him about the head. Whop, whop, whop. Wailing all over him, and then disappeared. The 2 other brothers came back. And the second brother, everything's fine. But then he took his older brother to the side. And his older brother said, was it really fine? No, it wasn't fine at all. This wizened little man beat me up with a stick. Me too. I know. Let's leave tomorrow so Hans can have his beating. And that was the third one. They didn't really like him. They never had liked him. They called him Stupid Hans. They always whispered about him behind his back. And so, it's only fair, think the brothers, that if the elder gets beaten and the second one gets beaten, that the third one gets beaten. And off they go. And Hans is there, and in comes, hello, could I please have a piece of bread? Of course, said Hans. He gave the bread to the gnome. The gnome dropped it. Now, pick it up for me. No, I won't pick it up for you. I give you free food. You drop it on the floor, and you want me to get on my hands and knees and pick it up for you? You're so lazy. If you're that hungry, pick it up yourself. What? Well, I'm not your slave. Pick up your own piece of bread. And so the gnome leaned over, and Hans took a stick and just beat him. Stop. If you stop, I'll tell you where the princesses are. So Hans stopped and said, who are you? I am a gnome. Some call me an elf, and there are another 1,000 like me. Do you know where the princesses are? I know where they are. And I will tell you where they are, but don't tell your brothers. Why not? Your brothers are not honorable men. They will cause you harm. Come with me. And so the gnome took Hans out to a well and gave him the instructions: a rope, a basket, and a bell. This well is empty, and when you descend, you will find the 3 princesses. Each of them is delousing a dragon. You have to kill the dragon and save the princesses. But don't tell your brother. Don't tell your brothers. That was the warning. The 2 older brothers came back to the castle, wondering if the bruises were going to show on Hans. Hans looked fine. They said, did anybody come and visit while we were gone? Yeah, a gnome came. A gnome came. Well, they said, did he do anything? Well, actually, no. He was really lazy, and he wouldn't pick up his own bread, so I beat him up. You did what? Well, I beat him up. And the 2 older brothers were so angry they turned yellow and then blue. Not only did I beat him up, said Hans, but he told me where the princesses are. And I will take you there. And so with a basket, a bell, and a rope, oh, and a knife, they went off. I'll go down the well, said the oldest. And so he was put in the basket, and he had the bell. He said, if I ring the bell, bring me up. And so he was lowered down, 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 not very far, until he was too frightened because he couldn't see anything. And he rang the bell, and he was pulled up, panting and sweating in fright. The second brother got in, and they let down the rope. It went longer and deeper, but he too was too frightened. He rang the bell, and they pulled him up. The third one, as I told you, the third one changes everything, right? He goes down, stupid Hans, exactly right. Stupid Hans goes down, 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 down. He has the bell, he has the knife, and he gets down, and there is a door, and he can hear this sort of snorting. He opens the door, and there is a beautiful princess with a 9-headed dragon, all heads in her lap, and she's picking lice out of the dragon scales. He takes the knife and he cuts off every single head. She leaps up into life. Oh my goodness. Takes her golden belt, puts it around his neck, gives him hugs and kisses. He says, I have to stop. There's another princess right behind that door. He opens a door. There's another princess, 5-headed dragon in her lap. She's picking the lice. He takes the knife, wham, 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 cuts off their heads. And that princess, oh my goodness, you saved me, hugs him, kisses him. Now there are 2 princesses who are adoring him. He says, wait, isn't there number 3? There's another door. He opens it. There's a princess, 4-headed dragon in her lap. The lice being plucked and dropped on the floor. He takes the knife, whack, 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 whack. Done. She leaps up, you saved us. And now these 3 princesses are hugging and kissing Hans because he saved their lives. He takes them back to the basket. He puts the oldest princess in the basket, rings the bell, and up that princess goes. He puts the second one, and up she goes. The basket comes down, the third one goes in. He rings the bell, up she goes. The basket comes down for Hans, and he remembers the warning of the gnome. And so he puts a stone in the basket, and he rings the bell. And the basket goes up and up and up, and the older brothers cut the rope. And the basket with the stone comes crashing down. And the 2 brothers are up there with those 3 princesses, and they look at the princesses in the eye and say, we saved you. You tell another story, and what will happen to you will surpass in pain what just happened to our younger brother. We saved you. And so off they went to the castle. And Hans was down there. The space, 3 rooms with slain dragons. Hans feels the loss of his brothers, and he paces trying to figure out how to get out of there. There's nothing in there except the bodies of the dragons, and he sees a flute on the wall. What in the world would anybody want to make music for down here? He says to himself. Ridiculous. He paces so long that it says in the story that he wears a path in the stone floor. That's a long time. And then he grabs the flute and he plays a note, and suddenly there's a gnome. He plays another note, there's another one, another one, another one. Every note he plays down into that room, gnomes, gnomes, everywhere. He said, whoa! Where'd you come from? We came from the music, they said. What do you wish for? To get out of here. Each gnome grabs him by the hair of his head and flies up, pulling him by the hairs of his head. And when he gets up, where does he go? He goes to the palace. He goes to the castle just on the wedding day, when his 2 brothers are going to marry 2 of those princesses. And when he walks in, imagine what he looks like. I mean, he's been down there in dragon for a long time. He walks in, and the 3 princesses see him, and they faint. The king said, whoever that man is, he is threatening my daughters to throw him in the dungeon. He comes out of that hole and is thrown back in a hole in the dungeon. And when the princesses regain consciousness, they say to their father, please, please don't lock him away. Why not, said the king. We can't tell you, they said. If we do, our lives are in danger. Well, said the king, you could tell the stove, couldn't you? And he leaves the room. And the three princesses tell the story of what happened into the stove. And the king is in the next room and he hears their voices coming through the stovepipe. And when he finds out that it was Hans who saved his daughters and the two others that lied, he had the two older brothers hung by the neck until dead. And Hans, that stupid one, married the princess, the youngest, and lived how? Happily ever after.